it's a requirement. Medical gas color coding. You notice we have two different code references here. We have the USA color coding and the ISO. Of course, we'll be addressing the USA. The ones that you often see in healthcare, well, really pretty much most of these, with the exception of maybe oxygen helium, which you might see in MRI, but the rest of them are pretty common. So gray cylinders you would see would be carbon dioxide. Medical air, yellow, again, that's a very common. Nitrogen, black. Nitrous oxide, blue. And then you got oxygen, skipping down to oxygen, green. And then vacuum suction, which is white. And the waste anesthetic gas is purple. So these are the common color codes you would see in healthcare. And it's good to memorize these, get to know these, pretty much know these like the back of your hand, because again, you come into contact with these, whether they're pipes above the ceiling or whether they're going to be cylinders in your bulk storage area. This is something to become expert at. Here's an example of a bulk liquid oxygen system. You notice obviously a big tank and a small tank. These are liquid oxygen. The smaller tank is there as a redundant backup system, so it's valved separately to the larger tank. And again, that's a fairly common configuration you'll find in most hospitals. Here's an example of a medical air system. One thing to keep in mind about medical air is that when you deliver medical air, it needs to be very, very clean, obviously, and it also needs to be dry. So on most medical air systems, you'll find either some type of refrigeration system that dehumidifies, or you'll find desiccant filters that are used to dry. And of course, both those systems require a fair amount of maintenance. I think that's the one thing that sometimes gets missed with these medical air systems. Otherwise, they're compressors and motors and just the storage tank. Vacuum systems, similar to medical air, being that they're pumps and motors and storage tanks, have one other very interesting special consideration you have to be very mindful of depending upon what type you have. And that is, you want to make sure that you have, if you have a water-cooled system, obviously if you were to lose water in your building for any reason, then you could lose your vacuum system. And sometimes folks don't realize that they can lose vacuum. And vacuum really is one of the most critical systems, especially when you look at for suction and for other medical clinical applications. It is used very frequently in surgery, OR. So vacuum, all medical gas systems are critical, but I think vacuum is one of the ones that once you lose vacuum, it really creates a very quick reaction. Typically out inside your hospital, you'll have other redundant systems, little portable vacuum systems that are used for emergencies and for backup. Something else I want to mention here, and I want to go back again to the, well, I won't go back, but I want to mention is that N+1 design. N+1, which is really a requirement in healthcare, means that you have the ability to have at least one more unit or a backup unit to what's needed. So the N, think of N as being needed, and the 1 is extra. And really, N+1 can either be a second system that sits there passively waiting to be used in case something fails, or it can be you have the system designed so that you have enough capacity where both, maybe let's say you have two things, there are two motors or two pumps that are running, and you have enough capacity so that if one were to fail, the other one has more than enough capacity to cover the load. So it doesn't necessarily mean that one isn't running. It could be both are running, or it could be that you're alternating back and forth. But in any case, you have one extra, and you'll hear N+1 quite a bit as we go through maintenance and operations and even codes and standards and design. So I just wanted to mention N+1 while we're at this point. Here's an interesting diagram. This diagram here shows us pretty much kind of a design of a basic medical gas system. Here you have your oxygen storage, your liquid tank, and you see, of course, there's your green line coming through and going to different places. Here it's tied into a manifold, maybe as a backup to these tanks here. And then you have it going to a gas supply monitor. Now, this monitor here, one might call it a master monitor, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. And then you have another manifold over here tied to N2O, or nitrous, and there's your blue going up and being distributed. Here it is, probably going up to OR. Over to all the way to the right, you got your compressors and your vacuum pumps and your tanks. And this here could be maybe some dehumidification for your medical air and monitoring as well. And over here, of course, on the other side is your vacuum system. And you see again, here's your gray line going up and probably up to the OR. And down here is your yellow, which is your medical air, and it's going up and out and being distributed. Interesting too, if you look here, these are kind of examples of like well, here's an operating room, and also here's a gas pressure monitor. One thing I want to bring note to is that if you look at this line right here, this is like the room wall, this gray line going up and down. And you'll notice that your gas monitor is outside the room, okay, and your shutoff valves, as well as things you will run into later as we talk about gas and medical gases, about location of shutoff valves and monitors. And you'll see the same thing over here in your ICU. Here's your outlets to your bed. Here is your shutoff valve outside the room. There's your gray line. And here's your gas pressure monitor. So a nice basic design. But when I was doing this, I also got to thinking, I wonder if there aren't maybe some issues with this basic design. And so I did mention a couple things that I kind of saw. And this is really this kind of, for those of you who work in healthcare, for those of you who look at things like this, know this code a little bit better than the folks that have not seen this before. Here are a couple things that you might find could be an issue with that little basic design. We didn't see a backup oxygen tank. Okay, there should have been a little tank there. The master monitor, I had put a question. I wonder if it's in a rated room, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And then, and is the master monitor in a monitored room? And then also, are the smaller tanks secured? So let's go back and look at this again and look at those things. So here's the room again. Okay, we got one tank. Okay, it's just a picture, but there should be a second tank. The thing about the monitor is this. Here's the gas monitor, okay? And interestingly enough, it's in a room that appears to be with all the manifolds and all these other tanks. Is this a rated room? Well, it almost certainly would have to be a rated room because, here's our wall. And when you have these tanks like this and all this has got to be a rated room. However, there's some things about this room which is interesting. One is that this gas monitor needs to be protected. I'm not so sure that I would put a gas monitor in the room with all the oxygen tanks. If there's going to be a fire or something like that, this whole thing's going to be engulfed, and this thing isn't really going to work. So I probably would have put this in a separate room. The other thing, is it monitored? Well, not very likely. There's probably a very good chance that this gas monitor is not monitored 24/7 as is required, or in a location where it can be monitored. This is obviously a storage room, and there probably aren't people in here. Might be in engineering or something like that, but even then, is that monitored 24/7? That's one of those code requirements. So just a couple of things when you look at these things like this. Again, this picture wasn't designed to be perfect. I know that, but as you start getting a trained eye, you'll start seeing these things. They'll start jumping out at you as you look at designs of things like this. Now here is a master alarm example, and you'll notice one thing that's very important here. This goes back to what we were just talking about. This master alarm is located at the telephone operator. Well, why is it located there? Well, because more than likely the telephone operator is there 24/7, 365. So it's monitored. Very important. Well, you also got to make sure that that's in a protected room. So that has to be a 1 hour rated room. So if you're going to put that in there, it needs to be in a rated room. Now here's the other one. Here's the master alarm located at the engineering department. So you have a second backup master alarm, but it's in engineering. Okay, so here's an example of master alarms. You have your different gases. This happens to say medical air. Medical air is fed into here. A lot of other oxygen is going to be fed into here. Vacuum is going to be fed into here. Your nitrous, if you have a bulk system, is going to be fed into here. Then you have the various alarms for the system. So this would be kind of a typical master alarm image. Here's an area alarm. Again, it's a little more basic. This also, I think, could combo as a master alarm. But this is another type of alarm system that you might see out there. And then you get another alarm system. And this is what we call a zone, I call local or zone alarm. Again, this becomes even more basic. Each one of these will have the amount of pressure, and they will alarm if those pressures go out of range. And these are typically, again, located outside of rooms. Sometimes they might be inside of rooms. But it's important to know too that if they're going to be located in the room, there's going to have to be valves outside the room as well. Typically these are all located outside the room. Here are some zone area valves. Again, this is often found outside of spaces or areas. If it's surgery, it would be found outside the surgery suite altogether. And then you would have the different, again, this has obviously gauges on it telling you the pressures. It also has the different valves here. This is one of those things where we've talked about over the years about exercising these. Do we exercise these like we should? What happens is if you don't exercise these, some of these valves, depending on what kind of valve they are, gate valve, or depending upon if it's a needle valve or otherwise, they can get dry rot out inside. And then when they go to use them, you can get all kinds of problems. So I know I've had problems with some of my older buildings where we did not exercise them, and then when we went to test them, either they were leaking very badly, and we had to have some kind of emergency shutdown to take care of it, or for that matter, in some cases, we physically could not turn them. They were just frozen in place. So it's definitely something to keep in mind about putting these on schedules and checking them and testing them with some frequency. Here's a classic oxygen outlet or outlets, medical gas outlets, pretty typical. There are different styles of outlets. One thing to keep in mind about outlets, and this is something that ran into with one of my facilities, is as we had different revisions of buildings added onto each other, we had a situation where we lost standardization of outlets, and we ended up with several style of outlets. Some outlets require different ways to connect them. And where that created problems for us is that certain equipment, particularly equipment used by respiratory therapy, if they were to take a crash cart and they were to have to go to a different unit, they would have to keep multiple adapters or different type hoses to connect to the outlets. And you could imagine new personnel, or maybe somebody didn't put the adapter back, and so they get to a code and they need to connect something, and guess what? They can't connect. So they scramble to find, an adapter or a connector, and that delay obviously could create an issue for patients. And we had a situation like that when we ended up going through and standardizing our outlets, and it took quite a while. It was a bit expensive, but again, you got to be careful when you go from one construction project to another construction project that you standardize your outlets, and in some cases upgrade them, because some of these older style outlets do have some inherent issues, and some of the newer style outlets obviously have more safety features in them. Just another picture of different accessories as it relates to medical gas. I just saw this image, and you saw all kinds of different things here. One of the things you see is down here, you see some springs and some O-rings and some other pieces and parts. These are just different things, rebuild kits that you might have to rebuild an outlet. Just thought this image would be something that would be interesting for you to see. Cylinders. Okay, well, when it comes to cylinders in healthcare, the two most common cylinders that you'll see in healthcare are the H cylinder, and this is usually what you'll see brought in for bulk manifolds and for bulk systems. Typically, you might see this for nitrogen or nitrous, oxygen too. You might have this in a medical office building. You might also see that in maybe a remote area that's not necessarily tied to the hospital. So it's pretty common to see the H tanks, and they're big. The other one that's very common is the E cylinder, and most of us are familiar with this because of oxygen. This is the one that you often see on the bed or on the crash cart, or you might see it on the wheelchair. One of the things about E cylinders is that when it comes to E cylinders, there's a certain number of E cylinders you're allowed to keep outside of a bulk area, and typically that number is 12. And what's interesting is you get yourself into a situation sometimes because that's 12 full cylinders. What about empties? Well, that's one of the things that causes problems, is separating empties and fulls. But the answer is 12 full. You can have the empty cylinders in addition to that, but they got to be considered empty, and they have to be in a separate holding area that says empty. Now, are they truly always empty? Not necessarily. But that is sort of the line that you walk, and that gets us into lots and lots of trouble in lots of areas. The other thing about these cylinders, which is very critical to understand, is securing them. They have to be secure. They cannot be laying on their sides. They have to be properly secured. And we're going to look at a couple images on that here in a minute. Here's a good example right here. So here's a manifold system with a bunch of green or oxygen tanks connected to it. But I wonder, when I look at it, when you look at this, you see this sort of, what is this stuff here? Is this holding this and securing it to that wall? My assessment is it's not. These are actually, it seems like these are just freestanding with nothing holding them up at all. In fact, over here you see similar. In fact, you can see them kind of here. They're kind of like bowling pins, but there's nothing holding this. So this would be a clear issue, having these cylinders just standing on their own like that, and it could be quite dangerous. We hate to think what would happen if one of these cylinders were to fall over and crack its valve. It would just be, it could almost be catastrophic, to be honest with you. Now this next thing, here we go again. Again, a little concerned here. We see a manifold system. We see all these black tanks. This here could be nitrous, I suppose, and it's all tied into this bulk manifold system. But are they secure? Again, I would question whether these are secure or not. Typically, when they're secure, you're going to see a chain around them. It'll be very, very obvious that they're secure. So it's interesting that these are marketing images that I found, but they're not showing that they're very secure. The last recording I wanted to, or the last slide, has to do with secure tanks. Just wanted you to see a couple examples. You'll see how you have one chain here across all the tanks, and then this other kind of design, special designed, figure shows chains around each one. Either one of these are acceptable. Obviously, the point is that they are secured. There certainly is some common sense to where you locate the chain, but this is an example. I just wanted you to see a good example of securing oxygen tanks. Something else to keep in mind too is when you're transporting tanks, there is a tendency to want to lay tanks down like in the back of a van. Well, technically not allowed to do that. You need to secure them in an upright position when you transport them. I think that's another common practice that people do, that they don't realize that they're violating codes when they do that. So that's it for medical gas and our overview. Again, this is just a nice light touch. There's lots of codes, lots of standards behind a lot of this that we'll touch as we go forward in other courses. But again, this should give you a good idea about medical gas systems in healthcare. A couple more slides that I wanted to put in here as I did this presentation was medical gas pipe labeling. Medical gas pipe labeling, again, this is one of those areas where I don't believe the accreditation agencies have scrutinized organizations maybe as closely as they could. In all the surveys I've been to, I have yet to have a surveyor actually take NFPA 99 and apply that code and concentrate on medical gas pipe labeling. It is very